Hey everybody, it's Bob Crossan, Senior Managing Editor for Water and Waste Digest, and today I have with me Allie Cunningham. She is a partner at Lathrop GPM who leads the PFAS subgroup, and we're going to be talking about PFAS in water, current regulatory status, and some difficulties that may surround the detection and treatment of this family of chemicals. So Allie, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad to join you today.
Talk about a really important subject. We were just talking before the call about how lead and copper is very top of mind for a lot of utilities now that everything is in effect, and we can expect similar things for PFAS. Before we get there, could you talk a little bit about what PFAS are so we know kind of like foundationally where we're talking from today?
Sure, absolutely. Be happy to do that. So PFAS are a group of chemicals. They've been around since, at least the 1950s. And they're in all kinds of household items. They're in, all your nonstick cookware, anything that's wrinkle resistant, stain resistant, your carpet, your couch, anything that's been treated to be wrinkle resistant or stain resistant. That's coming up more and more in, outdoor gear, athleisure gear, for kind of, having been treated with PFAS chemicals. So it's in about everything that you can imagine. It's ubiquitous, meaning that you really can't get rid of it. It's called a forever chemical for a reason. And so treatment and destruction of it is a huge problem. But yeah, it's a chemical that has a lot of good household use, but not so great for the environment long.
Yeah, or human beings, because it
Yes,
does compound.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I was
Um,
going to add, it's also probably in you and I right now. So
Yeah, yeah. You use the word ubiquitous, and that's truly the case. I know that for those who haven't seen it, I really recommend going to watch The Devil We Know. There's a whole documentary on Netflix kind of about this and just how ubiquitous it is and how hard it was to find a control blood sample
yeah,
to compare things to.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so anyway, could you talk about the current status of PFAS from a regulatory perspective? I know EPA recently released some information on kind of like the next steps that they're taking here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, EPA across administrations has been really aggressive about regulating PFAS, especially I would say in the last 5 years. But they've really taken off recently. They released what's called the PFAS roadmap, and all indications are they're sticking to the schedule, which is very aggressive. Aggressive. It seems to have a ton of regulatory milestones in place over the next 2 to 4 years, but I would say primarily in the next 2 to 3 years. And they focus on a broad spectrum of different laws. They look at CERCLA, RCRA, the Drinking Water Act, all kinds of different legal frameworks, but they set very aggressive milestones for regulating PFAS in a lot of different ways in a lot of different media. And it's going to be interesting to see if they can stick to the schedule.
Yeah. Well, and I know too that there are some states that are already kind of making their own things too. How does the stuff from the EPA, that federal level, compare to what we're seeing from some of those states?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, while I feel like the EPA is moving at a very fast pace for being the federal government, they're actually lagging behind in what most of the states are doing. So, a lot of states have created their own drinking water standards, in particular for PFOA and PFOS. We're starting to see surface water standards as well in a handful of states. And so that's creating a lot of difficulty. I mean, it's a regulatory patchwork. If you are an industry that's present in multiple states, it's challenging to know what's your compliance point in Michigan versus Pennsylvania. And now there's this distinct possibility that the EPA could come in with standards for all of the above, drinking water, surface water, et cetera, that conflict with what the states have. So, there's going to be a lot of reconciliation to do over the next few years. And I would say that even despite EPA releasing the roadmap and committing to this kind of aggressive timeline of regulation, you're not seeing the states slow down. I mean,
Mhm.
this legislative session is opening right now in a lot of states across the country, and you're seeing more PFAS legislation than ever.
Mhm.
And so states are continuing to regulate it regardless of what EPA is committed to. And I think it's going to make compliance difficult for private industry.
Oh yeah, for sure. I wanted to talk, so you mentioned this timeline. What are some of those challenges that you're foreseeing there? You touched on it a little bit, but are there additional challenges that you foresee with this aggressive timeline? I imagine as part of this, the challenges there is just like who it impacts as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of challenges from different perspectives. One is, I mean, can EPA keep up with their committed timeline? And I don't know if they can. For looking at my cheat sheet, but for wastewater discharge, they're proposing a rule and standard by summer of 2023. For drinking water, they're proposing a rule and standard by fall of 2022, and finalizing the limits by 2023. I mean, we're in 2022 now, and so it's going to be really hard to see if they can really, deal with the public comments and all that come with rulemaking and still keep with this schedule. And I think the other part of it, the flip side of that is, there are parts of the private industrial world that are still getting up to speed on PFAS. They don't understand what it is or how it affects their industry. And so, suddenly you're going to be bound by these regulations that you don't even really know anything about. And so I think the time to understand PFAS, potentially understand what liability you may have, and get up to speed on it is going to be short circuited. So
Yeah.
it's going to be tough.
Yeah. Well, one of the challenges here too, is, kind of mentioned it at the top, is the detection and treatment for these
Yeah.
things. And I know detection especially has been something that has been talked a lot about because it's only really been recently that we've been able to detect a parts per trillion, for one.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
so,
Yeah.
what are the challenges that we see, that what are the difficulties, I guess, surrounding that element of detection, and then we can talk about treatment after that.
Yeah. So with detection, I mean, right now, let's use drinking water as an example. There's a guidance level of 70 parts per trillion in drinking water. That in itself, as you're saying, is going to be very, very difficult to detect. Recently, the Science Advisory Board at EPA has re-reviewed their information, I'll put it, for PFOA and PFOS. And they have said that they think that the drinking water levels or guidelines should be even less than 70 parts per trillion.
Oh my
They've
goodness.
actually suggested numbers that are in the parts per quadrillion, which is insane. Yeah, and so the difficulty is that the regulatory framework doesn't match up with the science. I mean, there simply isn't a
Mhm.
laboratory method to detect PFAS in the parts per quadrillion. And
Yeah.
so they can set these standards, but how are you going to test to see if you can achieve them? I just, at this point, I don't know the answer to that. And so it's really creating quite the conundrum. And it leaves someone who is a water utility in a really tough spot, because you want to comply, you want to meet these regulatory standards, but you can't even collect the information that you need to know if you're in compliance or not.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I mean, parts per trillion is still, in terms of science, a very relatively new
Oh
like
yeah,
detection level,
absolutely.
and
Yeah,
going to parts per quadrillion, that is crazy.
it's wild. Yeah,
I,
it's
w I
crazy.
wish I wish I could do the math at this moment to explain what that is if you like did it in like
Yes,
an Olympic swimming pool or whatever, like they say for all the
I
other
wish I
ones.
could too. Yeah. I
But
mean, we always say that 70 parts per trillion is a grain of rice in an Olympic swimming pool. So I can't even guess
Mhm.
what parts per quadrillion will be. So, that's just wild.
Yeah, it truly is. That's going to be a really, really difficult thing from the detection standpoint, but also when you're thinking about the treatment, like if you have to detect that low, your treatment has to go real low then too, and
It does.
there's technology difficulties in reaching that potentially as well. I'm not as familiar with how far technology has gotten to that point yet.
Yeah.
But I mean, could you elaborate on those treatment technologies? I know GAC is a very big one in this part. Ion exchange also very top of the list together with that. But
Yeah.
are there things that are being discussed there in terms of trying to meet those like really, really stringent goals of detection?
It's interesting. I mean, I think EPA is looking at funding research to assist
Hmm.
with treatment. They released some guidance documents late last year or earlier this year. I can't remember exactly when, on kind of what the guidance technology, or the guidance on destruction technology is, and it was kind of like, we don't really have any answers for you right now. The best thing you can do is put it in a landfill. And so it wasn't very promising. I know there's a lot of people in the private sector who are researching the methods that you're talking about,
Hmm.
carbon filtration, ion exchange, reverse osmosis.
Hmm.
I think there's some promising studies, but I don't think anybody has come up with a real answer yet. For for those that are successful at removing PFAS, it's incredibly expensive to get to that. It's not something that I would say is workable on a large scale for like a wastewater treatment plant or a private water utility or municipal water utility. Particularly for wastewater treatment plants, they're going to get a lot of, they have the risk of having an influx of PFAS in their industrial discharge to them. And they really are the ones that need to look at this, destruction or treatment technology. And I think it's just not quite there yet. And so the EPA hasn't set effluent limitation guidelines yet, but they're moving towards doing that. That's part of the roadmap. And I hope that in the rulemaking, they will consider, the treatment options are very limited right now, and what's available is not cost effective. Because otherwise a wastewater treatment plant is going to be in a very difficult situation. And I mean, the other piece, sorry to keep rambling about it,
No,
but
no, keep going.
if you find a treatment technology like you mentioned carbon or the ion exchange, you generally end up with something, right, that's PFAS laden, like a filter or sludge or something, and you have to find a way to dispose of that. And that's also going to be challenging. What do you do with this kind of sort of concentrated PFAS residual at the end of the day? And not to take us too far into the weeds of the roadmap, but the other piece of it is they'll soon be designating, PFAS as a hazardous substance. And so is a wastewater treatment plant now going to be creating a hazardous waste byproduct that they have to find hazardous waste disposal for? It's a lot to ask of our utilities, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because I was actually going to bring it up myself of this hazardous material thing and just the liability concerns that it places on potentially places on municipalities that are
Yeah,
trying to treat and dispose of this when they aren't the ones who are creating it, right? So I know that there are a couple organizations and associations within the industry that are already discussing that and trying to talk to EPA leadership about, look, if we can't be held liable for these particular things
exactly.
under CERCLA and RCRA and all of that because we're not creating it, and it places a really undue burden upon the public to handle that. Anyway, I want to move on
No,
because
I
we could go
agree.
that could be its own discussion and
Yeah,
on its own, and maybe we could talk about that like in a couple of months or something like that. We can
yeah,
circle back and talk about that because I think that that's a really interesting topic area where I would love to dive more deeply into that and about the
yeah,
liability concerns that may pose. But um, in terms of impact on things, you talked about the impact on industrial facilities, on municipalities as well. Could you elaborate a little bit more on some of those main challenges? Like you said, the technology and cost effectiveness seems to be the core aspect there. Are there other elements here that you're seeing as potentially being a barrier for these facilities to meet and comply with things that EPA has on this roadmap?
yeah. I think just you know, we've touched on some of them, but I mean, there's the great unknown, right? I mean, we don't have any
Hmm.
idea at this point where the ELGs for a wastewater treatment plant could come in. We have no idea where the drinking water standard could come in. There's been some rumor, I guess, that they could potentially designate some PFAS as a carcinogen, which would mean you'd have a
Mm.
zero MCL for a drinking water standard. I don't, if you're a drinking water utility and your drinking water source has PFAS in it, what are you going to do with the zero drinking water MCL?
Hmm.
And you've seen some interesting discussions here about the intersection of like climate change and PFAS. We're dealing with drought in a large part of the West. And if those drinking water sources out there don't have PFAS contamination, what are we going to do?
Hmm.
Not to make it sound too dire,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
there's a lot of scary questions being asked without a lot of solutions. And I think the hope is that, as you were saying, even with the hazardous substance designation, that I hope our regulators are taking a step back and looking at the
Mhm.
big picture here, and what's going to be protective of human health and the environment from a broad perspective, not just from a PFAS perspective, because there's a lot of factors that are intersecting here.
Yeah, totally. And I will say knowing some of the people who are in leadership at EPA right now, I'm confident that they are listening. I would
Yeah,
say. So I think that they're listening, and I hope that they're taking it all to heart as well.
yeah.
Are there any other aspects of this of PFAS that I didn't touch on that you wanted to discuss today? I know that like we were talking before the call that like this interview is not going to be able to go too far with what we could actually talk about. There's so much to talk about in this space, but are there things that you wanted to touch on that maybe we didn't touch on yet?
I think we've hit kind of what's relevant for your audience. I mean, there's a lot here to digest. There's a lot of different facets to it, just even beyond the roadmap. There's biosolids application with PFAS
Mm-hmm.
contamination and all of these different directions that we could get into, and I'd love to talk more about them. But I think for me, the big message is stay tuned. There's a lot that's going to happen in the next 18 to 24 months.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have someone you feel like is keeping you abreast of what's happening in the PFAS world, find someone fast. If you have questions, reach out. I'm always happy to answer questions. And if you are wondering about your liability, we have lots of suggestions for how to handle that. You know, I could dive into a whole discussion of litigation and PFAS too, but I won't do
Yeah, well,
that.
I would certainly love to reconnect with you and talk about some of these things in a more centralized focus of like we're just going to talk about the liability thing today, and we're just going to
Yeah,
talk about this because I think that there's plenty of space for us to talk about that. And for everyone who's watching, I know that this has probably been a very enlightening discussion for you, and um, check out the video description below. We'll have some links to some resources down there. We'll make sure to get some resources from Allie here so that you can check out some of the things that she's talking about too. And Allie, thank you so much for being here and for taking the time with me today. It's been lovely to chat, and I'm looking forward to the next time.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.